Welcome back, all the people who are brave and come to another lecture. So far in this series, I've discussed a number of different kinds of disagreement. I've discussed disagreement about values, as when we discuss about abortion, whether or not we want to legalize abortion in the Philippines. I've discussed about different kinds of facts, like the fact that 2 + 2 makes 4, but also the thing which looks like a fact that person X suffers from a mental disorder, say ADHD, and is this really a fact? I've discussed about differences between scientific theories, so whether the Ptolemaic or the Copernican view of cosmology, whether the Earth goes around the Sun or whether the Sun goes around the Earth, which of these is correct. But all of these disagreements so far have something in common. In all of these cases, I do have the option of sort of saying, well, I just don't want to discuss that. So you don't have to have a view about abortion. You don't have to have a view about whether X is a mental disease or not. You don't have to have a view about Ptolemaic or Galilean cosmology. There's lots of things. A lot of the things we discuss in academia, you don't have to have a view at all. But sometimes we have issues where you do have to have a view. Imagine someone who's desperately ill and the doctors are discussing among themselves, either I give them an operation or I give them a drug. Now, there's no third option. All the doctors make in this disagreement know that without treatment, the patient is going to die. So they have to give a treatment. They just don't know which treatment they're going to give. A lot of real life decisions are like that. Like, suppose we're talking about war and peace. My country, a foreign country provokes my country. Well, I can reply with armed force and maybe start a war, or I can not reply. But there's no way I can do nothing. Like, not replying is a reply. For the doctor, not treating the patient is a decision. And so on and so on. We get the same thing for a company. I can invest in a new factory, or I can not invest. I can fire those people, or I can not fire them. All these are simple yes-no decisions. And very often I can make strong arguments for saying yes and strong arguments for saying no. And in this particular case, I find myself in a dilemma because I have arguments both ways, and I don't have the cop-out of saying, well, I'm just not going to decide anything. I'm just going to wait and see how it develops. An academic can do that. I don't know the causes of X or Y. Well, I just wait until there's more evidence. If I'm in one of these dilemmas, like war and peace, like a medical decision, like a decision of a pilot in an emergency, well, I don't have that luxury. I just have to make a decision. So my lecture this afternoon, is about dilemmas and decisions, things where it seems at least that there's only a yes or no answer. And so far, all the cases I've presented to you have been sort of either academic or political or very ethical. They've been pretty abstract. They're the sort of thing academics like. But talking to non-academics, they've suggested that many of the disagreements we have in real life are about practical human relationships. and very often practical human relationships, the humans involved, have lots of difficulties. So my story for today, which is fictional, it's not a real one, most of my other stories are real, are about a married couple, Susan and Paul, who are happily married. They get on together very well, they understand each other. There are no really deep conflicts in their relationship. But there's always a but. But Susan, many years before, had a deep, very important relationship with a guy called David, who later emigrated and went to Australia. So she hasn't seen him for a long time. Later she met Paul, they got married. All's okay. Now David's in town again. He's come in and he messages her and says, "Hi Susan, let's meet up for a drink at the bar tonight." And Susan actually liked David very much, and she's totally happy with her marriage. She's a totally faithful wife, but she still would like to see David. Paul, she tells Paul that, David's been on the line. I'd like to go and see him. And Paul doesn't like this one little bit. He trusts his wife. He doesn't think that she's going to abandon him for David or anything. But the idea of her drinking cocktails at some nice place while he's sitting at home watching the television, he just doesn't like it. And to be honest, he's a bit jealous. So, Susan doesn't really understand this. She doesn't like him being jealous. He's often jealous, He's jealous about the most stupid things when there's no reason. If he went to see his ex, she's no good anyhow, but she wouldn't mind. Why shouldn't he see his ex? He's not going to do it. And above all, she doesn't like Paul telling her what to do. This is really no-go. So she would really like to go on this date. Now, Paul's point of view. He's happily married to Susan and he trusts her. But he is jealous of David. And the fact that Susan isn't jealous of him, he doesn't take that as being so good. He'd actually prefer it if she was a bit more jealous. And he's uncomfortable with the idea that Susan should see David. And to be honest, in his heart and hearts, he'd much prefer that she finds a nice excuse and says, "Sorry, I'm in Taiwan at the moment," or "Sorry, I have lectures," or "Sorry, any date will do except the dates when you're available," and refuse. Now, there's no actual conflict at the moment. Susan, she's told Paul, but they haven't really had a discussion about it. She hasn't worked out what she's going to do. He hasn't worked out what he's going to do. But there's obviously tension in the air, and there's a decision to be made. This is one of my yes-no decisions. In the end, either she sees David, or she doesn't see David. And there's no third way. Or at least, that's what it seems. Now, first question, what should Susan do? And what should Paul do? In a few minutes, you could think about that. In a few minutes, I'm going to ask your personal opinions, what you think they should do. But before we get that far, I'd like to try and analyze their potential disagreement using the concepts which I've been developing in our previous lectures. Now, first question I want to ask is, what are they actually disagreeing about? If you remember, in my second lecture, I talked about cognitive illusions. That means that I often tell myself stories about why I have a certain behavior, or a certain attitude, or a certain belief, but those stories are not necessarily true, even if I believe them. So in this case, it's quite possible that Susan tells herself stories about why she's annoyed about Paul, and it's quite possible that Paul tells himself stories about why he is annoyed with Susan. Why do you think they're annoyed with each other? Any ideas? Do some mind reading, a bit of fictional analysis. What could be a reason why they're annoyed? Yeah, put yourself in their shoes. You might be annoyed too. You don't have to be married. You can make small changes to this, and it still applies. Any ideas? Yeah.
I think it's, in my opinion, it's a stark difference in which Susan she doesn't feel any jealousy.
Yeah.
And the possibility that maybe Paul could see is actually wants them and he shouldn't feel anything.
Yeah.
But Paul, on the other hand, maybe wants that kind of jealousy.
Yeah. So that's interesting. That's not one of the ones I've got, but it's a totally valid possible explanation. It's not one of the ones I suggested. Any other ideas? Well, I suggested when I was writing this is a fictional account. So usually when I tell stories, I have the truth I can go back to. But this one I invented. But so I said very simply, it's all about David. They're worried. Susan would like to see him, and Paul doesn't want her to see him. But maybe that's not true. Maybe actually, Susan doesn't really care that much whether she sees him or not. And maybe, this is just a fictional suggestion, maybe Paul isn't really that jealous. He says he is, but maybe he isn't. Maybe, can I just suggest, the conflict is about who runs the relationship. So, Susan wouldn't really mind that much if she doesn't see David. But if Paul tells her that she mustn't see David, well, then she's going to go and see him. Because Susan is a very autonomous lady, and she will definitely not have her partner tell her what to do. And vice versa. It's quite possible. Paul really does trust her. But he did have a twinge of jealousy, and he said what she should do. And he expects her, as a dutiful wife, to do what he says. And when she even sort of hints that she might not, well, that's rebellion. We can't have that. So I suspect that in this, it might be about David. It might be about the different kinds of jealousy, as you say. We'll never know because they're not real people. It might also be about power in the relationship, about who should be dominant in this relationship. I can't prove that, and of course I never will. But what we've seen at least 3 different interpretations. And if you used your imagination, you might be able to find more too. So the first lesson from this very fictional account is, we mustn't take for granted the vision of a disagreement which we ourselves have, or which the participants have. It's quite possible that we or they are suffering from an illusion. Now, second question. What kind of agreement is it? Well, is it a disagreement about scientific theories? I'd say really no. I can't see how scientific theories come into this. Is it a disagreement about values? Maybe. Susan puts one sort of value on jealousy. She says, not being jealous is a positive value, being jealous is a negative value. And Paul seems to have the opposite opinion. He says being jealous is good, not being jealous is bad. Or it could be about power. Paul thinks it's right that a relationship should be dominated by the man. And Susan thinks it's right that a relationship should be dominated by the woman. Or maybe they both feel that it should be an equal partnership, and they both think the other one is breaking that rule. So it could be a conflict about values. Is it a conflict about facts. Well, maybe that comes into it too. Like, how faithfully is Susan actually inclined? I've said she's faithful, but does Paul know that? Do they both have the same perception of that? I think in reality, what we have here is a sort of mix of values, the ones we just said, and of facts. And it's leading them into this sort of impossible dilemma. This sort of mix is fairly common. Do you remember when we discussed ADHD? Now, there are facts of this case. It is true that certain sort of treatments seem to have fairly good outcomes for patients. That argues that yes, it is good to classify this as a disease. It is equally true that most physical diseases, we know exactly the changes in the body which are associated with the disease. In the case of ADHD, this is not true. So we have a series of facts which we can weigh, some go in one direction and some go in another. But then we also have a series of value judgments. So yes, the person who's suffering from ADHD has a behavior which is on sort of one edge of a normal distribution. But does that mean it's pathological? Well, we can ask a question about that. I can have all sorts of behaviors which are strange, like I can run very, very fast. Or that doesn't mean that I'm suffering from a disease, but it does mean I'm abnormal in my athleticism compared to other people. But even assuming that it is something which hurts the person, that doesn't prove that it's a disease. There's a second evaluation I have to make is, what is the cause of this? Is it internal to me? So if I have pneumonia, the cause is internal to me. I give myself an antibiotic, it gets cured. Or is it the outside world, which is the person suffering just in an environment which is not well adapted for people like her, or maybe for any human being? So there's a mix of hard facts, but you always have in these disagreements a strong, many, many examples of evaluation as well. And this is, again, what we get in other dilemmas, like the ones we've been talking about. If I talk about war and peace, yes, there are facts. There are how many soldiers does he have? How many soldiers do I have? How big was the provocation? How much damage did it do? But there are also evaluations. On the one hand, if I fight back, this is going to cause deaths, it's going to cause destruction, it's going to cause loss to my country. On the other hand, if I don't fight back, well then I'm going to be cowardly, and the other country may come and dominate me in ways I don't want to be dominated, and so on. So there's always a mix of facts and evaluations. And I get the same when we have a corporate decision, like the decision of the company to invest or not to invest. And we get the same in this kind of personal situation. There are the facts of the situation, but there are also evaluations. Do we think this is good? Do we think it's bad? So, those are two preliminary sort of philosophical questions. But now, simple question. Shut your eyes for a second, please, everybody. Will those who think that Susan is in the right here, please raise their hand. Susan, we've got a lot of autonomy-oriented people here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 11 thinks, and who thinks Paul's right? 1, 2. So 11 to 2. So in 2019, a mixed audience of male and female Ateneans believe that Susan is right in this dispute. That's interesting. Okay, now, those of you who think Susan is right, I've got 11 people to choose from. Why do you think she's right? the pro-Susan people? Come on, you did have a reason for saying this, or is it just instinctive?
I'm sure you have reasons.
Yeah, I'm sure you have reasons too. This is not about cosmology. You're allowed not to know if the sun goes around the earth or vice versa, but okay. Why is she right? Oh yes.
I do agree that I mentioned a bit is about power and freedom, which I think Susan should have the right to do what she wants. But I also think we could look at it from the point of view of trust as well. If her husband could trust her to make the decision and not, do anything sketchy.
Okay. I think that's a very clear answer. Do you all agree with that? Does anyone have anything to add to that? That seems like fairly. Now let's hear the other side. The minority who thinks that Paul is right. It's all right. Yeah.
I sort of changed my mind.
There's still a minority. There were two people, I think. Yes. Can you speak louder, please?
In terms of power,
Yeah.
where we put the idea national
Okay. That is a value judgment, which I think we could spend the next 3 lessons discussing that one. I suspect it's going to be controversial, but we won't. But okay, it's a value judgment. The man should run the relationship, and obviously that puts Paulo in the right. He wants this, and therefore this, in this view, is what we get. Now, can I suggest? Yeah.
Like my position is exactly what you mentioned. Trust and freedom, but as the role plays the other side, there might be a position of being sensitive to all
So the sensitivities at the other end.
of people. So knowing that I could get hurt if you perceive that the same thing. So that's probably if I have to take the other thing, which personally I'm not taking, I would think that's good.
Okay. Yeah. That's fine. That's fine. Now, in previous lectures, I said that sometimes it's not possible to say in the abstract who is right or who is wrong. I suggested a good test we can use is to look at the consequences of a decision in one sense or another. In all the decisions I've been talking about, war and peace, corporate investment, and these personal relationships, this is possible. But unfortunately, when we look at the consequences, it gets a bit complicated. So, supposing Susan does meet David. Well, if we take her word for it, she's going to be happy. But she may well, because of the sensitivity issue, she may well also feel guilty. Paul is going to, he doesn't have, his trust isn't that good, and he's going to spend a rather anxious evening. Oh, is she home yet? Is she home yet? Is she home yet? That's not so good either. And very likely, he's going to be upset because it was clear to her that this was going to hurt him, and she did it anyhow. She doesn't care about me. Now, so, we can have the opposite. Susan is very, finds an excuse. She tells David she's going to be in Taiwan or whatever, and she doesn't meet him. Well, this way, Paul's happy, he got his way, but he also feels a bit guilty because he realizes that Susan has made a sacrifice for him. Susan is sorry she didn't meet David. Probably, actually, the real enjoyment she got from meeting him wouldn't be that enormous, but now that she's not meeting him, she sort of exaggerates how much she'd have enjoyed it. And she's also sorry that she gave in to Paul. Why did I I do this every time. Oh, it's terrible. So, the bad thing is that whatever happens in this dilemma, if she does meet David, or if she doesn't, it's a double bind. Whichever happens, there's probably going to be tension in the marriage, which is usually not something which anyone enjoys, and not usually a good thing. So, what could they possibly do? Well, sorry, not got that. Some of Susan's friends tell her, you know, you should have a proper rational discussion with your husband. Say it coolly, explain everything to him well, and he should stay cool, and then you just work it out. And some of Paul's friends say, well, you know, you should just have a cool, rational discussion with your wife, explain her duties to her if she hasn't noticed, and tell her what you expect of her, and then everything will be fine. Now, can I make a prediction I'm really confident about? Neither of these approaches is going to work. Have you ever experienced a cool, rational discussion of that kind, in which everyone comes out feeling how happy they are? Well, I'm not sure I have. I don't think that it's a beautiful ideal. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy would probably be very happy, but I just don't believe it exists in the real world. That's not how discussions actually happen. So, I don't think pure rationality is the solution. And any solution which just keeps the question the way we've posed it so far and just looks at the consequences is not going to work either, because the consequences seem to be negative whatever happens. And actually, there's a lot of decisions like that. Think about the discussion on legalizing abortion. Well, if you're a devout Catholic who seriously believes in the right to life, and if you fight to keep abortion illegal, women are going to die, because of illegal abortions, and you're going to have a serious problem with your right to life. But at the same time, if you say, okay, well then, despite myself, I will allow the legalization, I am going to have fetuses which are aborted, and this also goes against my values. So it looks like if I decide one way, I lose, and if I decide the other way, I also lose. Suppose you're a student in difficulty, you accept the doctor's view that the ADHD is a disease. Well, you're going to be medicalized, you're going to take medicine and so on, and this is going to be a problem for you. But suppose you refuse that view. Well, then you're going to not have anyone to look after you, you're going to be left with all your problems, you're going to be on your own. It seems that whatever you decide, you're going to be in a bad way. Suppose you're a country which is invaded, or which simply is provoked by another country. Well, you can fight and get yourself killed, or you can not fight and you can get yourself dominated. Again, whichever way you choose, you seem to be in an impossible dilemma. Now, in previous lectures, I looked at disagreements about values, disagreements about facts, disagreements about scientific theories. And each time it looked as though many of the participants believed there was only one right answer. When I talked about facts, there is a fact of the matter. People believe this is true and this is false. Values, people believe these are the true values and these other values are false. The same with science. People believe this is the correct theory of the universe and this is an incorrect theory. But what I was suggesting in the lectures were actually there can be more than one system of values which works. there can be more than one way of looking at a fact which is adequate, which you can do without falsifying what you know. There can be more than one scientific theory which explains a certain phenomenon. And what I'm going to suggest is that when you're in one of these impossible dilemmas, as Susan and Paul are here, there can actually be multiple solutions. But before I get that far, I want to do a little experiment with you. I'm going to hand out these sheets of paper. One. One. How many of you are there? And three times. Some people can get one paper, some are going to get the other. I'm not going to say you cover it. Please don't show your piece of paper. It's a psychological experiment. You have one yet? No. Who hasn't got one yet? Two. Ah. Okay. Two. One. Oh. So, what I would like you to do is consider a scenario. Now, there is a terrible epidemic, and we don't really know how to treat it. And we have a new experimental drug, which might work, might not. Now, on your sheet of paper, you have written the information you're given about the experimental drug. Now, do you believe we should use this drug or not? So just look at your sheet of paper and decide whether we should. It's obviously a risk to use the drug. Should we use the drug or should we not use the drug? I'm sure you've all decided, right? Can you just put a cross on the piece of paper saying what you believe? On the yes, yes means we should use the drug. No means we should not use the drug. It's good doing experimental psychology in the middle of a philosophy lecture. Be fairly quick. It doesn't require deep thought. Just give your gut reaction. Okay, have you all done it? Can I collect the paper again, please? It's not really where you planned. Any more? I think you do better than doctors at Stanford. So this is an experiment which Daniel Kahneman talks about in his book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. So first, half of you, roughly half, got a formulation in which it said, with the experimental drug, 30% of the patients will die. And with that, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's amazing. 5, you don't behave. 6, you don't behave as you're expected to.
Maybe some of us have seen it before.
Maybe some of you have seen it before. So actually, only 1 person out of 8 says we shouldn't use the drug. Everybody else says we should use it. And those who got the second one was, with the experimental drug, approximately 70% of the patients will survive. And here, everyone said yes. Basically, you all say yes the whole time. But at Stanford, when Kahneman did the experiment, he found that if you put it in terms of people dying, 30% of the patients will die. Doctors tend to say, oh, that's far too much. We can't possibly use the drug. And if you say 70% will survive, which is exactly the same statement, they all said, oh, that's fine, that's great, let's use the drug. But you're much more rational than the people at Stanford. So you basically, most of you said, we'll take the risk anyhow, because it's still better to have some chance of survival than to die anyhow, which is reasonable enough. But the point here, which I didn't make with this experiment, it was a failed experiment, was that when people look at a situation, they are deeply influenced by the questions they are asked. The way Kahneman calls this the framing illusion. The way you react to a question depends deeply, except for you, who you're so rational. For everybody else, it depends deeply on the way the question is framed. So, can we possibly reframe the problem for Susan and Paul? Now, the way in my initial framing, which reflects all my own prejudices, I framed this as a problem, basically, of power. Susan doesn't want to give up her wishes. She doesn't want to give in to Paul's silly jealousy. And Paul does not want Susan to go against his wishes. So my framing of the problem is that Susan's autonomy, Susan is interested in her autonomy and freedom, and Paul is interested in limiting that autonomy and freedom. Now, if you put it in this way, there is no way out. Because either way, whether or not Susan does actually meet with David, someone's wishes are going to be thwarted, and someone's going to be unhappy, and the marriage is going to suffer. Maybe a little bit, maybe a lot. It depends on how important the issue is. Now, suppose we look at it in another way. We forget about the power aspect. Susan would actually get a lot of pleasure, or she thinks she would get a lot of pleasure from meeting David. So obviously, that we want somehow to give her that pleasure. And Paul will get displeasure from this because he's jealous. So, is there any way we can reframe the problem in such a way as we maximize Susan's pleasure and minimize Paul's displeasure? Does anyone have any creative ideas? I can think of quite a few. Any ideas? Yes. Oh, okay. All three. I'm going to hear all three in the middle. Yes.
Is it possible for Susan to bring Paul together? That's what we do here in the Philippines.
Hello, meet my ex. Okay, that's one solution. Same one, yes?
Me, it's more of bring other friends.
Okay, meet David with other friends, also possible. And maybe with Paul as well. But one thing, that's not exclusive. Anything else? These are all, anything more creative? Or different? Yes? No. You had a wicked idea. I could see sin coming out. Yes?
Have Paul and David meet each other.
Have Paul and David meet each other while Susan spends the evening with Paul's ex. Well, that's another way of putting it. But think a minute. You're very honest people. But if Susan met David and Paul didn't even know, would he be jealous? No. We say out of heart, out of sight, out of mind. Well, that could be an idea. She could always tell him afterwards when he knows that nothing has happened, and she would still be honest. Is it absolutely mandatory to talk about it first? There's all sorts of things we could do. Like, Susan could realize that seeing him isn't really that important, but she doesn't want to give him to Paul. So she doesn't tell Paul he's coming. For David, she invents a plausible reason she can't be there. And the whole problem evaporates, right? Okay, she doesn't meet him, but she hasn't had to give in to Paul. And that's important for her. There's the second solution I've just suggested. She doesn't tell Paul he's coming. She sees him, enjoys their time together, and she tells David later. Maybe. That's not the most honest of all solutions, but it might work. Paul knows his jealousy is completely unreasonable. He also knows he'll be jealous if he knows they're meeting. So he says to Susan, "Oh, go on, meet him, but will you not tell me when? Tell me afterwards. It's okay." I don't know, maybe that's too fictional, I don't know. But there's all sorts of things, and there's your suggestions you made as well. So what I'm suggesting is, there's a vast range of solutions which gets rid of the problem. But I can go even further. If I'm going to judge which solution is best, I have to actually know what the participants in this disagreement want. And this is not actually as obvious as you might think. We haven't talked at all about their real goals in the marriage. So, as good Ateneans and modern people, we think that their goals should both be to make the marriage work as a partnership among equals. Now that's a beautiful modern goal, and maybe they both share this goal. And this is just fine, and that suggests certain solutions to the problem. But it's not the only goal. It's not the only goal possible. Maybe they both actually accept that the marriage should be unequal, and that Susan is the dominant partner. If that was their goal, or if Paul can accept that, well then maybe they behave in a different way, and maybe Susan can be a little bit more pushy, and Paul can be a little bit more flexible. And remember, this sounds a bit strange, because this is not the socially normative way of behaving in a marriage. But if you just wrote this the other way around and said that making the marriage work as an unequal partnership with Paul dominant, well, that's what a lot of marriages are. So if ethically you can accept the third solution, I don't see any reason why you can't select the second solution as well. I think they're morally equivalent, at least from my point of view. So which solution you're going to choose depends how you judge the consequences of their behavior. And I say in real life, all three of these are possible. It's not that everyone always chooses option number one. And then, of course, there's a fourth option. Maybe Susan is just fed up that every time she wants to do something, whatever it is, however trivial, Paul just says no. And she says, "I can't stand this anymore." Or maybe Paul is just fed up. Even my least wish, even every single feeling I have, she just ignores. She always wants to go her own way. Well, I know it's not socially normative, but marriages can fail. And this is another option. So, when you have a disagreement, you don't always have to solve it. Sometimes you can just say, this is a big disagreement and we're not going to solve it. But even if I take one of those goals, I can still have more than one solution for each goal. I looked at different ways in which Paul and Susan could find an agreement under the assumption they want an equal partnership. But of course, if their goal is, if actually they're perfectly happy with an unequal partnership, then there's lots of solutions they can find in which one of them dominates, makes the decision, and the other one just says yes, or just tolerates it, moans a little bit, but lets it go on. There's something else I need to say. They have this disagreement. In the end, they will take a decision of some kind. Something will happen. But the consequences of this are not apparent. Remember all the friends who say, just go and have a nice, cool, rational discussion and the problem will be resolved. The friends believe in good faith that this is going to work. But if we have a little bit more psychological insight, we may know that it's not going to work. And I really predict it's not going to work. Now, whatever the parties to this disagreement whatever they think at the time, they really don't know how it's going to work out. So, suppose Susan gives in to Paul. Well, it might mean that they're heading for a happy, very conventional marriage in which Paul is dominant. It might mean that she's so unhappy with what she's done, she becomes very militant, and the whole balance of power in the relationship changes in her favor, because suddenly she starts standing up for what she wants. And it may mean that the marriage fails and leads to divorce. We just don't know. But there are some things we do know. Remember when I was talking about value systems, I said some value systems just can't work. They're inadequate. So we took the Kantian example. If I just say that everyone lies, we can always lie at any time. There's no moral problem with lying. Well, then any society based on that is going to fall apart. If I could say, I just must never cooperate. I'm not going to fight for my country. I'm not going to help the person who's in difficulty. I'm never going to cooperate. Well, I refuse to believe that a society based on that can ever survive. So some value systems don't work. Some purported facts don't work. If you really believe you can cure all your diseases with crystals, like some people in California believe, well then I'm sorry, but you're not going to cure your diseases and you're going to have big problems. That's an inadequate belief. And some say, if you think that the world floats on the back of an elephant, or that the earth is flat, or that the earth is only 6,000 years old, these are not adequate beliefs. They're not going to get you anywhere. So what I'm saying that you can have multiple solutions to a problem, but you can also have non-solutions. You can have very bad solutions. Now suppose Paul and Susan actually get round to talking about this. What would be really bad solutions for them? Things they shouldn't do. What could you do to really wreck things? Well, I'll give some examples. I can, instead of talking about whether I'm going to go and meet David, I could start attacking Paul's behavior. I could start saying, every time I want to do something, you always say this. And of course, Paul can do exactly the same thing with Susan's behavior. I hardly ever ask you to do anything. This time I'm asking and you're saying no. You know, this is typical form of a domestic dispute. So you can attack the other person's behavior. And this very often happens actually in real life disagreements, not just personal disagreements, but also in much more important disputes, like in political disputes or in business disputes. You can go even further than that. There's a theories of negotiation where that's a first step in escalation. What can you do which is even worse than that? You could start attacking who the person is. You can attack their very identity. You're just stupid. You just don't care about me at all. And so on. And this is no longer behavior. You're saying, you in your nature, you are stupid, you are cruel, you're aggressive, you're whatever. You're whatever the person wants to accuse you of. Now, when people in a disagreement start moving away from the problem, start moving away from different solutions to the problem and their consequences, when they escalate it to the other person's behavior, worse still, to the other person's personal characteristics, you're ugly. This is a sure recipe for the disagreement to get worse. And the higher you escalate, the harder it is to back. The disagreement is going to get more and more heated, and the harder it is for anybody to back down. Therefore, the less likely it is that the disagreement is going to be resolved. So, some courses of action are not going to work. Another key lesson is it's okay not to reach an agreement. Like some problems are genuinely, you're not going to do it. Galileo is not going to agree with the 17th century Catholic Church about his views of cosmology. It's not going to happen. In fact, there's a myth. It's probably a myth, but there's a story. So Galileo gets put on trial for his views, and they actually they say, you must recant. You have to confess that your views are no good. And they show him the instruments of torture. They show him what will happen to him if he doesn't recant. So Galileo is quite an old man, and he sort of likes keeping life and limb together. He's not going to be a martyr. So he says, okay, I recant. And he actually signed a statement in which he said that he's only using his theories as a mathematical tool to predict the position of the planets and so on, but actually in real life, of course, the sun and the planets all go around the Earth. He wrote that and he signed it. And then according to myth, he turned around and said, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves, meaning the Earth moves. But he said that out of hearing of the Inquisitor. Now that may or may not be true, but that is what I mean. He wasn't going to give up on his ideas. So, where have we got so far? And I'm really talking about all the lectures, not just about this one. The reasons we think we disagree are not necessarily the reasons we really disagree. We may have many unconscious motives for disagreeing, like in this case, the power struggle between Paul and Susan. If you want to reach an agreement, there's more than one goal you can set yourselves. You don't have to keep the disagreement in the same form it started off in. Even when you have a common goal, there's more than one solution. There's more than one way to get there. We don't usually know. It's great to judge on consequences, but that's good in hindsight. Usually at the time, we don't know what the consequences are going to be, but we do know that certain behaviors are inadequate. Certain things will make the disagreement impossible. And finally, we know there are cases where it's probably a good thing that we don't agree. What can we say? Well, basically, I've said all this already. But basically, summing up, just reasoning from the evidence, accepting the views of epistemic superiors, and adopting a rational style of discussion is not going to solve your problems. And sometimes it doesn't even help. So, just one final note. All this looks at disagreement as conflict, as something absolutely terrible. But I'm a player of this. Does anyone know what this game is? This is the Japanese game of Go. It's for anyone who's interested, it's an absolutely wonderful game. It takes about 10 minutes to learn, and then the next 20 years to get even moderately good. It's a beautiful game. So Go is a simulated military struggle. These are the whites are the soldiers belonging to one side, the blacks are the soldiers belonging to the other side. And if you think of other games, like if you think of boxing, well, Philippine national sport, or if you think even of chess, the goal is to wipe out your opponent. You get a KO. He's on the floor, concussed, slight brain damage, that's great. Go, we're much more civilized people in Go. In Go, bad players try and wipe out their opponent, and they usually lose. But good players try and have a beautiful game. A beautiful game means one where the pattern of soldiers or stones on the board becomes beautiful. And this is because you disagree in constructive and beautiful ways. And actually one of the key things you learn in Go is a thing called a joseki. A joseki is the equivalent of an opening move in chess. It's the first few moves you make. And you learn a joseki, there's thousands of them, you can study them. At the end of a joseki, the two partners are in exactly equal position. You don't learn how to win, because you can't, because each initial move has a perfectly good answer, but you learn how to keep a proper balance with your opponent, with the other discussant. And so sometimes you can actually find enjoyable, creative ways of disagreeing, where what you get at the end is a feel-good feeling, and not all the sort of nasty personal feelings which we had here. And sometimes in good personal relationships, that's what people get. There's no personal relationship with no tension. That doesn't exist if it's a real relationship. But sometimes people can work together so well that I make a little move in this direction, you make a little move in that direction, you make a little move in this direction, and we say, oh my God, this really works. This is our way of making beautiful shapes. Now, this can happen in personal relationships. It can also happen in the big world outside. So in my next lecture, on Wednesday, I'm going to be talking about how we can sometimes make peace, and how we can be very constructive in making peace, and how we can use some of the tactics I talked about here were purely invented. The story of Susan and Paul was pure fiction. But I'm going to show how in some real life disputes, both big political disputes with deaths and minor personal disputes, people can make creative moves which lead to the solution of the problem. So, that's what I have to say for today. Questions or suggestions or anything else? Yes.
Just like to clarify the point wherein it's okay not to reach an agreement.
Yeah.
This doesn't necessarily mean inaction.
Inaction.
Like the choice of or the decision not to accept that there is no agreement to be made at this moment in time. Let's say in the case of Susan and Paul, what happens? Like what happens when they decide not to reach an agreement at that given moment? So like when it comes
well, of course, it depends. In this particular case, it depends how they decide. But like, it can happen that one of the two says, well, I'm just doing what I want, and just take it or leave it. And that's going to leave a big conflict. Susan says, well, I don't care, I'm going. See you tonight. Or Paul, or she can give in. She say, okay, I don't go, but you know. Or they can say, we go to the divorce lawyer. This is also possible. Or they can find all sorts of ways about not talking about it. The silence at the breakfast table. So there's all sorts of ways in which you can not reach an agreement. But I was seeing an agreement as something actually positive, where They get out of it and they both think that it's a good solution. So I wouldn't call an agreement something where one side loses. It's a really good agreement is where both sides, it's win-win. It's where both sides saying, this is okay. Yes?
Is divorce also an agreement?
It can be. I think sometimes people can actually agree creatively to divorce, and there exist friendly divorces, there exist dramatically unfriendly divorces. So it's not necessarily an agreement. I think it can be.
I just want to share a story.
Yeah.
I have a friend who was a divorcee. Then he met a guy and they had a grand wedding. Right? And then after the wedding, every time she made a decision, the guy was questioning, how come you did not consult me? And my friend said, I've been making these decisions all my life. Why do I have to consult you? And the guy said, because you are now married to me, I must know what your decisions are. And the ending was, they said it was not going to work, so they had to do it. So that was
That's the stuff. Sure. So this is the sort of powers, and I think it particularly happens to people who get married later in life, because you're two very, very autonomous people, and suddenly you get together, and there's all sorts of expectations about what's going to happen next. Sure, this is real, so you can just decide this is not resolvable. And then you can decide, screaming and shouting and doing all the bad things I talked about earlier. You can say that the other person is immoral, that the other person doesn't have any consideration for me, and blah, blah, and so on. Or you can just say that this doesn't work. And you can leave and still be good friends afterwards, or at least not enemies. And many divorced people who have children manage to not be enemies at all afterwards. It doesn't have to be a fight. It can be a fight. Yes?
In the bow example where there was kind of satisfaction with the concept of balance.
Yeah.
You had to presuppose some kind of experience in tension and adversarial nature of the game.
Oh yeah. So Go player, this is really what, the more experienced you are, the more beauty you can feel like this. It's like all forms of beauty. If you play a musical instrument, the more you play, the more you appreciate it. This is the art of disagreement on a Go board. And you discover it's an art only when you sort of stop doing the silly things. So it's very disappointing for an opponent. So for instance, if my opponent makes a really stupid move, this is disappointing because he deprives me of the pleasure of a well-balanced game. So yes, you need experience to appreciate it. I think most beauty you need experience to appreciate. Yes?
Didn't reach an agreement with the disagreement. Then what's the possibility to get violence?
Well, of course, that's not. Of course, any disagreement can lead to violence. It can be any of the disagreements we've discussed in their extreme manifestations lead to violence. We've had violence in the debate on abortion. I think I hope not in this country, but certainly in the United States, there's been a lot of violence about it. We even have fighting among scientists, which sometimes, it's not always with guns, but they're not nice at all. Fighting among neuroscientists is vicious. So yes, it can lead to violence. Clausewitz said that war was the continuation of politics by other means. And I think you can continue disagreements with violent means. I don't think that's a good thing, but yes, you can. And of course, supposing your very survival is at stake, we're really talking about survival, then maybe violence isn't always wrong. But maybe you should defend your if I'm going to be wiped off the face of the earth by an enemy, maybe I need to make my position clear violently.
just have a point raised about framing effects and framing illusions. I think there are various kinds of framing effects, like the order of presentation, and also that information you are given about the opinion of peers seems to be a very strong determinant of how a certain view is framed. And I think as we were talking about the disagreement, this personal disagreement, and it's analog in other areas, I was thinking about how it's possible to talk about the adequate view of facts, which is a transposition of Wong's moralities.
I took it from there, yes.
Right. And then we can align that with the idea that despite the framing effects, which we cannot completely avoid, because this is how our cognition functions.
We live in that way.
Yes, we can, we can talk about ways of viewing facts affected by framing illusion, but still adequate, right? And then we can talk about the range of responses under consideration that are maybe more viable in some sense.
And that's maybe, that is one of the roles of, remember we had this social model of disagreement, where you can see a disagreement as being between me and you. And we are likely to see our disagreement framed in just one way, and we can't really see a way out of that. But if we are embedded in a social reality, it's quite, and particularly if the social reality has a bit of variation in it, it's quite likely that other people may give us different ways of framing the problem, and therefore an adequate approach is to listen to other people as well as just fighting it out among ourselves. So if you're a scientist, first thing you do when you write a paper is you read the literature and you say, oh, someone said that before. And when he said it, it was proved he was wrong. Aha, this is good. But we can do this in our daily lives. If you have a personal dispute, I suspect you're going to talk, if it's any serious at all, you're going to talk to your friends about it. And your friends may have a different line on this. If they're good friends, they won't just say, you're right. They will look at the dispute in a different way and say, well, do you realize why this person is saying this? Or could we look at it another way? Maybe there's a different solution. Maybe they're the ones who are going to invite you all out to dinner together. Your Filipino solution. So I think we're better at this collectively. It's true that groups have their dangers, right? Groups can be just anonymous and unanimous about everything. But groups can also help a lot. But particularly groups where everyone doesn't have the same position.
Yeah, but I'm wondering though, it can be useful to have, if you have a disagreement between A and B, and basically that means they probably frame the issue in the same way, and one of them believes we should go one way and the other one believes we should go the other. But if we have multiple framings happening in the discussion, there's going to be a problem of talking past each other. Right? So I think that finding some way so that the variability doesn't become
just lack of communication.
Talking across.
Talking past each other.
Yes.
How would you suggest we could do that?
Well, I think some exercise in trying to lead people to think outside
the box.
No, outside
their framing.
Their frame of reference. For instance, can you think of a way to arrive at the conclusion that you have, not using the premises you've used before?
Okay. Yeah.
Or
there's been experiments with this, right?
Yes. So I think in some cases that way.
Does Jonathan Haidt talks about this, I believe. I've read about it, but I'm not quite sure where.
I'm not so sure.
So I think that's a lesson we can draw, that sort of finding a way of accessing multiple framings of the problem or different framings of the problem, framings of the problem that are different from my own, can help to move beyond a sort of static, fixed way of discussing. wrapping up. So, my next lecture on Wednesday is about creative ways of disagreeing. And we're actually going to see some, this lecture was purely imaginary, I invented the case. But the cases I'm going to be discussing in the next lecture are all real. So we're going to be talking about a class of mathematicians who invent new math by disagreeing with each other. We're going to be talking about peace in Northern Ireland and South Africa, where we actually saved lots of lives by reframing problems. And we're going to be talking about a nice feel-good story about how a lady made peace with her very noisy neighbor in a condo who was having parties at 3 a.m. in the morning. But we'll find that on Wednesday, same time, same place. Thank you.